Hello, good to see you. I saw some of you were in the waiting room, anxiously awaiting our start. We'll get started in about a minute. If you want to go ahead and access the link that I have here on the screen, tinyurl.com/APLang virtual lessons. It's also in the description of our YouTube video. You just have to click show more. And then once you go in there, you'll see resources for 4.9. Anything that's labeled 4-9, you can open. There won't be much, really just a blank rhetorical situation graphic and then something for practice. We're not looking at prompts today. We're just looking at, we might reference the prompts from the last 2 days. So if you want to pull up the Albright and the Thatcher from 4.8, go right ahead. Otherwise, we'll just kind of wait a few more seconds and then we'll get started. About 30 more seconds. All right, for those of you just joining us, again, I have a link up on our screen for tinyurl.com/APLang virtual lessons. If you go to that link, you can access resources that we'll use for all of our sessions. Today, there are two that I'll be referencing. One is labeled 4-9, blank rhetorical situation graphic. If you want to open that up, make a copy, download, or if you just want to kind of sketch it on a separate piece of paper, it's really more of a graphic organizer for the content we're covering today. For your homework tonight, you'll have something labeled 4-9 AP practice. It's a passage and 2 multiple choice questions. And if you aren't familiar with the Albright passage we looked at yesterday or the Thatcher passage, the eulogy that you looked at for homework last night, you might want to open those. We're not going to study them by any means today, but I'll reference them in passing here and there. So if you're not familiar with those, they're on yesterday's session. So it'll be labeled 4.8 prompt for lesson, I think 4.8 AP practice / Thatcher. So you might want to pause and just do a quick overview if you think that might help you contextualize the content for today. But we don't have a specific prompt we will be looking at other than reviewing Thatcher's from yesterday. All right. I'm Mrs. Velitis. I'm from Naperville North High School. I teach AP language there. I'm living a little bit outside of Chicago, and I am just mystified by this weather. I shouldn't be. It's a very typical Chicago spring, where I think 2 days ago I was outside grading thesis statements from my students getting sunburned, and tonight we're supposed to get thunder snow. Yes, thunder snow. That is a thing in Illinois. Basically just a thunderstorm of snow, and I'm going to hide in my basement and not watch it so I don't cry. I need spring. But anyways, it's good to see you guys. I hope wherever you are, things are sunny or it's exactly what you hope it would be, your weather, and that you're enjoying your time. I will say, just a small challenge to you guys. My task for my students today was to give me some suggestions of something to read, watch, or do. Going a little stir crazy here in Chicago. So it might be nice if you reached out to your teacher with a note saying, hello, how are you? And just update them on something that you've read or that you've watched or something you'd recommend your teacher do. If your teachers are like me, I'm sure that they would love to hear from you. We went over this information yesterday, but just to make sure we are all on the same page, the AP exam has now been pushed back to May 20th. And on May 20th, you will go in at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and to a secure platform still to be announced and delivered. And then you'll be given a free response question that's a rhetorical analysis prompt. From there, you'll have 45 minutes to write, and then you can handwrite it and upload a photo of that, or you can type directly in the screen itself. So, because you're only being tested on rhetorical analysis, that's what our review sessions will be focused on for the next 4 weeks. Um, Yesterday, we looked at how do you attack the prompt. I'll review that today briefly in the beginning. Today, we'll be talking about the rhetorical situation, but you can see the topics and kind of pick and choose which you think best pertains to you. So, tomorrow, we're looking at introductions, but maybe you're like, I'm good with that, but I would love to hear more about a thesis statement. Tune in on the 13th. If you need more help with identifying certain rhetorical devices or strategies, maybe you look at the 22nd through the 28th. So here's just a brief look at some of the topics we'll be covering, and I hope we see you again. All right, so let's review what we talked about yesterday. If you did not watch or participate in yesterday's session, just try to follow along with the steps and keep in the back of your mind, am I currently doing these steps? And if not, what could I add to my current routine? I taught the students yesterday the same method I teach my own students, which is try to only take 10 minutes with the prompt and the passage in the beginning, primarily because as you're writing your essay, you'll naturally go back into the text. And so you'll get to know it at a more deeper level later. So only take 10 minutes. The first 3 is just to annotate the prompt specifically for the rhetorical situation. And then the next 7 minutes is to read the passage, looking for main ideas, just jotting a few words in the margins to capture the essence of a paragraph or 2 paragraphs combined. Underline any lines, words, phrases that really speak to the task in the prompt, the message. Then study some of those key lines, paraphrase them, put them into your own words. Look to deepen your understanding of the rhetorical situation because the prompt will give you something fairly vague. And then the last tip is for the more sophisticated readers. It's a really challenging task, but it's a really important one to think about how does the passage move? It could be from beginning to end. It could be in terms of topics, but looking at, do I see any kind of trend or pattern emerging in the text? So we'll review today. I asked students to look at a eulogy for that Margaret Thatcher delivered at Ronald Reagan's funeral. And here was the prompt. You can look and pause if you need to, but you can look here and compare and contrast your prompt annotations to mine. I will admit, I think that this is a tricky prompt because so many of the elements overlap, which I think is a perfect message for our lesson today, that you can try to isolate, but so many of them impact and influence the other. So for example, the exigence is really kind of the fact that Ronald Reagan has died, but that's also kind of the context that he has passed away. Um, and then that speaks a little bit to the audience that they are there to hear Margaret Thatcher honor Ronald Reagan and to convey her respect for him. So taking 3 minutes for that. Then attacking the passage by doing a quick read, writing in the margins the main ideas, studying those key lines, looking for the rhetorical situation, and then identifying any shifts. I would assume we are not the same word for word. So if your passage isn't annotated like mine, I think that that's absolutely fine. But here are some things that you might have noticed. That in the beginning, she starts kind of capturing his cheer and his lightheartedness, specifically when she was referencing how he was making jokes after an assassination attempt. So she tries to capture his persona, him as a human. Then she moved in toward the bottom of the first column to discussing how others viewed him or viewed certain situations, what their expectations were, and then how he defied those expectations. So there were several quotes that were like, others saw this, he saw this. Specifically, others saw limits, he saw growth. So she's making some comparisons there and some contrast. Then in the second column, she's focusing more on his values. And again, you might not have the same words, but I hope that you captured something about who he was as a man. She had lines like, he knew his own mind, he had his principles. Then that filtered down into his leadership style, him as a president, and how he didn't shrink from Moscow. And then she concluded, kind of again returning to his values and how he had certain values that really captured the essence of America. I think it's the final line says he stood for freedom and opportunity for the ordinary people. So looking at him, again, almost like a symbol for America. Some of the key lines that I noticed were looking at lines 8 through 10, 36 through 39, 60 through 61, and 90 through 92. And one of the tips I gave yesterday was make sure you're choosing from a variety of places, and that it's not just, okay, well, I'm going to, underline 3 things and they're all in the beginning, because then you're missing the end of the passage. So try to spread them out. All of these, I think, are great lines, and I think that they capture a lot about the prompt itself and her respect for Ronald Reagan and how she was feeling as a speaker. So the first one's really talking about how, he faced significant challenges like an assassination attempt, but that he did it with a free spirit, with a heart, a lightness of spirit. And the second quote that I pulled out, it was referencing the Cold War and how he could defeat an enemy without having to resort to violence, and if anything, turn them into friends, which is a trait of a strong leader. For quote number 3, the them, that pronoun there is referring to his values. So he expounded his values clearly. He stated them clearly. He lived those values. He acted upon them assertively. And then the last thing is, again, kind of capturing his generous spirit, his compassion, all things that symbolize America. The prompt gave us elements of the rhetorical situation, so it does serve like a spark notes. It gives you a direction to take when you're diving into the passage. It's a lot easier to understand a passage when you have a little bit of a preview. So we have that, but the passage gives us so much more. So in something as simple as in the prompt, the passage was just to honor or to convey. The more you're reading the passage and her speech itself, you're really understanding that she's trying to evoke sympathy and she's trying to comfort people by telling them these stories about Ronald Reagan as a man. And if the exigence is the fact that he's passed away, she's there to honor him. We learn things though, like she's a close friend of his. They work together as allies, and that she's mourning him as well, and that she wants to honor his achievements and help shape how people remember him. That when you study the passage, even if only in 7 minutes, you understand the rhetorical situation is so much more than just the generic brief example or brief references that the prompt will give you. So you saw my annotations before. Ours might not have looked the exact same, but something roughly like this. Yesterday, when we were talking about chunking the passage, one of the things in identifying shifts, don't say the word chunk, but referencing those shifts or identifying those shifts is a lot of times, not always, but a lot of the times you'll see that they move chronologically. So from the beginning of the passage to the end of the passage. And we said, it could be first half, second half, you have 2 chunks. It might be beginning, middle, end, and you have 3 chunks. This one wasn't as fluid as that. You can see that if we had to divide it out chronologically, we'd kind of have like 5 different paragraphs, and that's way too much. But if you look at those notes in the margins, you do see that 2 topics start to emerge, 2 themes. One looks at Ronald Reagan as a man, his cheer, his lightheartedness, and then his values in that second column, things that describe him as a person, as a human, things that she thinks really reflects who he is. So that's one thing that you could see. Another that I think starts to emerge is looking at him as a leader. And again, just taking my annotations, if he's defying others, and we see something about his leadership, and then him symbolizing America, all of those things we could kind of summarize and step back and say, that's looking at him as a leader. So while it doesn't move chronologically, we still have 2 chunks, Ronald Reagan as a man and Ronald Reagan as a leader. And then sometimes I get really excited about writing and rhetorical analysis. This is where it gets really exciting. Hold on to your seats. I have my essay pretty much written out for me. I have 2 body paragraphs here. One about Ronald Reagan as a man. That's the main idea that I'm trying to prove in my body paragraph. And I know exactly where to go back into the passage to find my choices. And I'm going to pull choices out that convey that idea. So I have my body paragraph. My outline is essentially captured through my notes. And then my second body paragraph is about him as a leader. And again, I'm going to go back into those moments and try to find some choices that really communicate who he was as a leader. It makes it a lot easier when you approach it this way. All right, so for today, we're going to be talking about the rhetorical situation. I'm sure you guys are sick of it. I'm a little sick of it because we've talked about it so much, but it's a cornerstone. The whole essay really stems from your understanding of the rhetorical situation. So we have to spend a little bit more time with it. We're going to look specifically at that rhetorical situation. And then today we'll start to move more into how the writers make strategic writing choices based on that situation, and how those choices are to achieve a larger purpose. I think it's important to start with the word rhetoric. And this isn't meant to be an in-depth lesson at all, but I think that that helps, again, kind of frame your learning for today. So I'm going to give you a few key terms that to me really helps elucidate what rhetoric means. First, going back to Aristotle, rhetoric is essentially the art of effective or persuasive speaking and writing. And the rhetor is someone who essentially is speaking or writing persuasively, or at least intending to. Those rhetors, they create arguments when some situation demands a response. It's not like they're just sitting around thinking, I'm just going to share my ideas. There's something that has happened that has caused them to respond in some capacity. Therefore, the rhetorical situation is the context in which speakers or writers create rhetorical discourse, that communication, and that they make choices based on that context. In your essay prompts, you'll see they all start and sound the same with write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices the writer makes to ... Think of this as kind of like your roadmap to the prompt as well. The first thing you have to do is understand that rhetorical discourse. We know that individuals write within a particular situation, so you have to understand that particular situation before you get to the choices. So we're going to look at the rhetorical situation in more depth. Again, I know we've touched on it in probably 7 of our 9 lessons. So we've touched on it, and I'm assuming that you don't need the basics. I will give you the basics. Feel free to pause the recording and read them more slowly, take more notes if you need to. But that my goal is really to kind of highlight the way in which these components aren't really isolated, but how they play off of each other, and so how they relate. And I'll also try to give you some strategies, some tips, or just good to know information about each element that might help influence your reading of a passage and help your understanding of the rhetorical situation to be more sophisticated and not just that basic level, what you would get from the prompt. So in your resources for today, you have a blank graphic that, again, you can pull up, you can draw on a separate piece of paper, you can make a copy or download, whatever you'd like, if you think you need to take notes. And again, I would encourage you to not write down every little thing, but just something that's new to you about each element. I also want to give a quick shout out to Mrs. Mariah Brown. She is an AP English language teacher at Norwalk in Iowa, at Norwalk Community Unit School District. And she's the one who created this fantastic graphic. I've had several teachers email me asking for a copy of it. I use it with my students because I think she did such a great job of visually capturing what the rhetorical situation is about. I love the questions she's posed. So shout out to Mrs. Brown. She's a genius. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at is technically not part of the rhetorical situation, but I think it's a really good reminder for any of us, and that's genre. If you can stop and recognize what genre or what the medium is of the text, it really kind of governs your whole understanding of the passage as is. AP language is built all around rhetoric, but some of the things I think you've probably seen a lot from your teachers are speeches essays, letters, and possibly reviews for like movies, music, books, things like that. These are some of the more common mediums that are seen, especially on the AP exam. So speeches, personal letters are very, very popular. I don't know what you'll see May 20th. I don't have my crystal ball, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's some sort of a medium like this. For the speech, if you recognize or if you're given a prompt that is a speech, really pause and think about the purpose of the speech, and just what it would be for any situation. So eulogy, you know, it will always be a sad occasion, and someone is trying to commemorate or memorialize someone. We looked at Madeleine Albright and her commencement speech. It's probably going to be something along the lines of inspiring and motivating. And I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm assuming that you guys have read some presidential speeches. That too greatly depends on the context and the purpose, like what's happening that's causing the president to speak. But you've maybe also looked at sermons or closing arguments of legal cases. All of those, try to think about how you could choose, how for your rhetorical analysis, you might be choosing things that apply to that medium. So if it's a speech, I would choose things that are meant to be heard, like imagery, powerful language, maybe repetition, things that are meant to be heard and not read, as opposed to an essay where if you're a reader and it's coming from a longer work and you're pausing in the book to read it, or if it's an article from a publication that maybe you're viewing online or in the hard newspaper itself, you could pause and really take those words in. So something like a syntactical structure, you might see more in an essay. The other thing to keep in mind with an essay is your audience might not be as clear. With a speech, it's pretty clear who it's being delivered to. Of course, there are always exceptions to that, but speeches, the audience is usually pretty clear. Essays, it might be tough. You're going to have to really study the passage, the tone of the passage, the argument, and how it's constructed to really kind of narrow down who is the intended audience then. For the personal letter, my only tip or reminder is typically, again, there are exceptions, but typically these were meant to be private. They weren't meant to be consumed by the public. So keep that in mind as well. It's again, most likely an intimate letter from one person to another. And it's not as though the letter is being written for mass consumption. That might govern your understanding of the rhetorical situation as well. For review, just think about the argument and then the values of the writer. All right, so let's look at context next. It's the time, place, and climate in which the text occurs. Here are some details. Here are some questions you might ask. Feel free to, again, to a pause if you want to read these in more depth or take any notes on those. But what I think is important to highlight for you of context is incredibly important to understanding the climate in which the writer is creating. Students who understand the context understand the broader context, which is addressed through the sophistication point. So I'm thinking like right now with everything that's happening with COVID-19, if, and it's not going to be me, but if I were to write an article about the importance of the restaurant industry, the way I construct it and compose it this week would be vastly different than if I wrote an article 6 months ago, because the climate, because of what's happening to our restaurants and our chefs and the places we frequent so often, that the context would greatly influence how I construct it. You'll hear me say this a lot. It's going to be hard to tell from the prompt. Usually the prompt will just give you a date. Because of that, typically my students who are in AP US history or who have a lot of knowledge about contemporary events, current events, they tend to do well on the prompt itself because they have that contextual knowledge. I'm not trying to say that you need to go out there and take a crash course of US history. You certainly don't, because the prompt and or the passage will give you enough to understand it. But context is really important for understanding those larger issues and what's really at stake. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is really close to context, and that's exigence. It's the reason that the writer is creating the piece. It's typically an event that's going to inspire, provoke, or prompt the reader to create the text. So it is similar to context. It's what is happening, but usually this is what is the context is this is what has happened. And then the exigence says, so here's why I feel compelled to write. It's what's prompting them, what's making them feel as though they don't have a choice. I need to step forward and say what I believe or share my insights. Again, the prompt won't give you a whole lot. A lot of the times it'll be generic. So dive into the passage itself and keep in mind that exigence will vary quite a bit from one text to the next or one prompt to the next. So for example, with Ronald Reagan, the piece that you guys looked at last night, the eulogy for that, sorry, Margaret Thatcher's eulogy for Ronald Reagan, on a very surface level, you could say the exigence is, well, Ronald Reagan died. And that is true. But again, once you start studying the passage, you recognize that it was more than just he died and she was asked to show up at his funeral and say a few things, that it was her way of honoring her friend, of trying to, again, kind of like shape how other people see him. She was compelled to share her views of him in the hopes that that's how people would remember him. So the exigence is it's really going to be driven or clearer through your understanding of the passage. And that's a very personal connection. Madeleine Albright speaking about Ronald Reagan. Sometimes it might not be as personal or as immediate. Again, I think about Madeleine Albright in the commencement speech. They were probably just looking for a high profile speaker who came in. It's not as though she was compelled and said, I've got to go speak to a graduating class at Mount Holyoke College. But you could make the case, though, that the context is what really influenced the message of her speech, and that maybe she saw that the exigence gave her an opportunity to share her views on equality and gender rights through that speech, that it gave her an avenue that she was hoping to explore. So it might not be as urgent or as personal, or might not appear to be as personal. And that the more you study the passage, I think the clearer the exigence will become. The speaker, it's kind of obvious, it's the person who's creating the text. It too will depend on the genre, especially when it comes to understanding the values and the beliefs. Now, one thing I would encourage you to do is if you are given a passage and you really, on your essay, you really want to focus on the persona, the writer, him or herself, make choices or identify choices that really speak to ethos and appeal to the reader's sense of ethos. So anything that shows the speaker's authority. So demonstrating proficiency in the topic or the issue, some key details that the writer makes about the topic or issue that demonstrates competency. Could even be something like the allusions the writer makes helps to highlight the values, the beliefs, and the needs. And then it should be obvious, the thing that goes hand in hand with the speaker and is maybe the most important element is the audience. For the audience, though, I would highlight that I'm sure your teachers have told you this, it's not just everyone. Instead, think about the intended receivers of the text. So who the speaker intends to receive the message. Even if it's a presidential speech, like a State of the Union, that is widely consumed, not even in our country, but for around the world, by studying the passage itself, by studying the piece, you can understand more about an angle that the speaker, the president's trying to take, or a particular group he's trying to appeal to. So audience is never going to be everyone, even if at first glance it appears that way. And keep in mind that you probably aren't the audience as well, unless it's a passage very clearly directed toward high school students. The other thing I think is important to keep in mind is the gap between the speaker and the audience, and that the speaker is trying to persuade the audience to believe or understand something. So there's some sort of gap, some sort of constraint between them. So what is the speaker going to do in order to minimize that gap, to make them be on the same page? Again, for an essay, I would really be looking at anything that appeals to pathos, anything that really responds to or connects with the audience. So as humans, we're naturally drawn to imagery, dramatic language and diction, a direct address like the word you, the pronoun you, and sometimes even repetition. So thinking about what might really appeal to this particular audience and the emotions of that audience. All right, so purpose is the next piece we're going to look at. That's the goal, outcome, or the reaction, the intended or hoped reaction of the piece. The prompt, because the stable language will always say like to convey, to develop, or to achieve. So again, broken record here, study the passage to go beyond that. And think of the purpose as kind of like an extension of the exigence. If the exigence is what is compelling the writer to write, then this is what are they hoping to accomplish then through their writing. So you might look at the two hand in hand or how they influence each other. It's also going to be tied to the genre. Typically, the purpose is a to blank. So, depending on the genre, like a eulogy or a commencement, it will be to honor or commemorate. Commencement address would be to inspire. So, the genre might also help you understand a little bit more about the purpose. Some common purposes are things like to advocate, sometimes it's to denounce, to mourn, to encourage, to plead, to chastise. Um, that there are a lot of ways in which a writer might appeal to their audience, but everything will go back to them. What are they really trying to achieve? All right, and then our last one, the message. This too is a little complicated and it is sometimes confused with purpose. The message is like the content or the subject matter of the text. Sometimes it's a little literal. And the prompt will give you the message. Now, keep in mind that's meant to be very topical, fairly broad, generic, and that you should go beyond the message of the prompt, even in your thesis. So, for example, with the eulogy that you read for homework last night, I think the prompt says something to convey her reverence for Ronald Reagan. That's the purpose, and the message they give you is to convey or her reverence for him. But go beyond that. If your thesis simply states to convey her reverence, it's not showing that you have any real insight, that you're just borrowing the same language. So take some time to understand what that means. If it's the Madeleine Albright and the idea of perseverance and why it's important, think why is it important? In what way? What does she mean by perseverance? How do you showcase perseverance? So try to think about what it might signify or suggest. So again, if the prompt says to write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices the writer makes, first try to understand the particular situation before you get to your choices, because then those strategic writing choices have to be based on that situation. You're not being asked to analyze the writer's style or analyze writing style. You're being asked to analyze the rhetorical choices. So the choices have to be tied to the rhetoric, to the argument, to the act of persuasion. You might recognize alliteration in a passage, but it doesn't mean anything if it wasn't a choice that was made because of the situation, the context in which the writer is constructing. Later in the week, next week, we will have an entire session dedicated to rhetorical choices and what are they? How do you choose them? How do you make sure they're appropriate? But I wanted to touch just briefly on some of the choices that I think are pretty common. Don't worry so much about the semantics. A rhetorical choice is a device or a strategy. Don't worry so much about being able to delineate one from the next. Think about this though as you are moving forward in your work in AP language and which of these choices, the device or the strategy, is really speaking to what the writer intended. It could be something that's very small and found within the text, like at the insular level, the word choice, like a word, the syntax repetition, certain words being repeated, alliteration, allusions. But you might also think more at a macro level, the piece as a whole, thinking about appeals, tone, how it's organized or structured, or even some of the details that are included. That this list isn't meant to be exhaustive, but more of just a quick reference that the choices should be tied to rhetoric. All right, so we're almost done. Let me give you a quick real world experience. I'm sorry if this offends any of you. I hate the dentist. I hate the dentist so much. I think it stems from when I was a little girl and having cavities and just being terrified. But I mean, it's to the point where sometimes if I have to have a procedure, I have to have Xanax because I just get so worked up. So this summer in July, I went in and sat down in the chair. I had my hands clenched to the point where my knuckles were white. I then at one point started to grip the chair itself, and you could see the veins popping out of my arms. My eyes weren't just closed and resting, they were squinted shut. My jaw was clenched. And the hygienist recognized, she read the situation. She recognized some of the things that I was feeling. She could see that I was reluctant and that I was struggling. So because of that, she made some changes to how she treated me. So she would rub my shoulder occasionally. She was very clear of what was happening and when. She continually kept asking, how are you feeling? If I were to go in there and completely unafraid of the dentist and just sat in the chair and she started rubbing my shoulders, it'd be a little creepy. So I'm not suggesting that the hygienist is a writer and I'm her audience, but this is kind of a representation of the rhetorical situation. She's kind of the speaker, and she recognized a value or a belief in her audience, and she made certain choices based on what she could see in my reactions. Just to add a little levity and to end on a funny note, a little Tiger King note, that's something else I did last week on spring break, is unfortunately waste about 8 hours of my life watching the travesty of the Tiger King. But I think that this is a really funny meme that captures how I think you should approach the rhetorical analysis prompt. Don't go into the passage looking just for the rhetorical devices. If they aren't attached to meaning, then it's going to read as a mid to a low essay. Instead, start turning and looking first at the rhetorical situation. If you can then situate those devices in the rhetorical situation, then it isn't you analyzing your writer's style, it's you completing the task. It's you looking at the rhetorical choices, not just the random choices a writer could be making. All right, so just a quick review, and I'm going to ask you to pause your screens. I've given you 6 descriptions of elements of the rhetorical situation: exigence, writer, audience, purpose, context, and message. I want you to pause the recording briefly and see if you can match them up to make sure you understand how each thing functions, how you might define them. So you could fill in the blanks, or you could draw a line, but take a moment, like maybe a minute or two, to read through the definitions, the descriptions, and think, what is this defining? Which element is it defining? And then I'll give you the answers. All right, if you're ready for the answers, they look like this. So the purpose is what the writer hopes to accomplish. The writer's perceptions of an audience's value, beliefs, needs guide the choices. An audience of a text has shared as well as individual beliefs, values, needs. Writers create text within a particular context, time, place, and occasion. The exigence is the part that inspires, stimulates, or provokes or prompts the writers to create a text. And the message is the general topic, content, ideas, etc. How'd you do? I'm hoping good. Hope you did well. Okay, so just a quick review. Individuals write within a particular situation. They can read the room. They understand what is happening to the audience and what they value, and that maybe their values are really dependent upon the context of what's happening in the world. And so then the writer feels compelled the exigence feels compelled to share a message with this particular audience for a purpose. And the writer makes choices based on that situation. All of these things, they don't stand in isolation. They influence one another, and they should inform your understanding of a passage and help you then determine which choices you select. So tonight for your AP practice, it's a pretty quick review, a quick practice. There's a wonderful passage from a contemporary writer called In the Country We Love. I've given you a copy of the text itself, and I have two multiple choice questions for you that are asking about elements of the rhetorical situation. Take a few minutes tonight to read through that, and then tomorrow we'll go over the answers for each of those, and then we'll start talking about, now that you understand the passage itself, how do you write an introduction? What does a good intro look like, and what does a great intro look like? All right, so thanks for watching. Make sure you complete your practice questions. It shouldn't take you too long, maybe about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll review those answers tomorrow. And I hope you guys have a great day. No thunder, snow for you.